our special guest star this month, is Tamil Periasamy, who will be talking to us about JavaScript. Take it away.
All right. Good morning, everyone. So the talk today is about from hot to not, using JavaScript and also jQuery. jQuery is the more popular library that's used with JavaScript. Cool. My name is Tamil, to repeat that again, for those who came in later. And I have been working with JavaScript, not continuously, but I have dabbled with JavaScript since it began in '96. Now back then I was actually in elementary school when I started, to make some people who feel old now feel older.
Thank you very much.
I actually went to Georgia Tech and studied aerospace engineering there. And when I did that, I kind of took a break from coding, from making websites. I did a lot of web development back in the late '90s and early aughts, because I thought that was kind of the field I was going to go into. And then I was like, nope, I like airplanes. And then after I got my degree, I was like, I might need to look into this web development stuff again. In the time that I was in college, and I was an undergrad between 2003 and 2007, web development, in particular JavaScript, blossomed in a way that if it had been that way prior to me going to college, I probably would have gotten a degree in CS and not aerospace. So, and that's something I'm going to discuss when we get into the history of JavaScript. In terms of actual web development experience, I got assigned to tutor someone in HTML and CSS about like 5 years ago. And it was surprising to me that I actually retained all the information, because I was teaching them at like the 2000 level, and I was able to teach them the basics, but then they were teaching me back all this new stuff that has happened in the web world, and that got me interested. And then also work experiences kind of started taking me in the direction of web development. JavaScript, really I got back into it starting in 2014, and it just so happened, for those of you who know who Mike Schinkel and Micah Wood are, those two have had a company, New Clarity, and when they started up, they pulled me in to be their JavaScript developer back in 2014, and that's when I started working full-time as a JavaScript / front-end web developer. So I've had a very interesting route, almost like a full circle, except not really, of my experience. And I don't know how many of you still use maybe possibly Notepad to work on sites. If okay, yeah. I was explaining this to my friend last night when I was putting the presentation together, that when push comes to shove, when I'm dealing with a site that seems to get so complex or complicated, what I do actually, in order to ease my mind, is actually take the site and put it back into Notepad, take it away from Sublime or PHP Storm or whatever, and that actually for some reason works in me being able to decipher the material, which when we look at JavaScript code would be kind of confusing, especially for those who have little to no experience with JavaScript. But then that's why I'm also going to talk about jQuery. Let's click introductions. Yay, we did that. And okay, so we went around and we talked about JavaScript. What is specifically JavaScript, besides the fact that it is an object-oriented programming language? What it does? Do people know what an HTML page and what a CSS page is? Okay, good. So what JavaScript does is it adds dynamic content to a web page, and the way it works, it looks a bit dark on my end, but I'm assuming you guys are able to see the diagram in the bottom. Okay. So the way it works is your web browser, you type in a URL, it pings a web server, which then returns a series of files. An HTML, CSS, JavaScript, any other file, PHP, whatnot, but the HTML file is usually the important one, especially the one that says index.html. That is the one that links to to the web page when you pull it up. Then, let's see, there we go. So the HTML page provides the content for your site. The CSS page or pages styles the content on your site, and then the JavaScript adds behavior or the dynamic interactions that you can have with your web page. And it does that through something called the DOM, or the Document Object Model. And we're going to go a little more into that later. But all you need to know is that the HTML page creates your, basically think of DOM as like an outline of your web page, and therefore with JavaScript it is able to pick out specific places in your code that it can then manipulate. And we'll be looking at some examples of that later on. Another thing about me, I like to tell stories. So I wrote this up talking about basically taking a Christmas carol and revamping it to call it a Christmas code, to explore the history of JavaScript. And basically it deals with the character, I don't know if you've heard of him, Ebenezer Scrooge. He doesn't like dealing with JavaScript. He thinks it's kind of an old school language and he'd rather stick with some other dynamic content language to deal with his web page. So then he's visited by 3 spirits, and when the bell tolls 1, the ghost of JavaScript past shows up. And Scrooge asks the ghost, "Who and what are you?" And the ghost says, "Var ghost, I am the ghost of JavaScript past, semicolon. Var display, ghost.blink. Scrooge, humbug. This is going to be a long night indeed. Ghost, alert, this ghost is best viewed with Netscape Navigator 2.0. I'm assuming a lot of you now remember back in those days. Yeah, so basically, when the internet first came into existence, there was a need for a dynamic interaction with the content. And let's see, I totally forgot the company. Does anyone know off the top of the head the company that created? I want to say Sun, but I'm pretty sure that's not the case. No, Sun Microsystems, because they are the ones that also created Netscape. Yes, okay, cool. So it was Sun Microsystems who created JavaScript. They wrote the language in 10 days. This was meant to be kind of an experiment, and it was codenamed Mocha, to see if something can be done on the client side of a web browser. And when Mocha was created and released as a beta test, they realized that it worked surprisingly well, so they renamed it LiveScript. And then, well, first it was renamed and then released as LiveScript. And then when Netscape Navigator went to I guess the most popular version of its Navigator, which was 2.0, it then renamed it to JavaScript. And this is a popular misconception. You probably see this maybe in a lot of job postings where they're just like, we need a front-end web developer, must know JavaScript and Java. Or they may say, must know HTML, CSS, and Java. And that's kind of not how Java works. And the thing is, the only reason why Sun chose to rename it JavaScript was to sort of ride on the coattails of the popularity of Java, which was incredibly popular at the time. Java at that time was pretty huge. So using the term JavaScript made it seem like this was a variant of Java that could be used for web pages. But for those who have dabbled in both, they know that it's they're very much not alike. In 1996, Microsoft releases JScript to go alongside their Internet Explorer 3. Just like tangent, how many of you have heard the news about Microsoft ending 8, 9, and 10? Although at the same time, what is their new browser? Edge. Yeah, it's basically. Yeah, really.
Ending doesn't matter because the people that are still on it don't realize they're losing support, so it's not really.
That's true. I just read it and I'm just like, oh, that's so awesome. I don't even use it. I think when I got this computer, I used Internet Explorer just to so I could get Chrome, and then that was it. So yeah, so in 96, and even though it says 95, 96, it was literally a matter of months in which Microsoft released a competitive version of their JavaScript. And what kept them competitive was that they had specific properties and methods that were different from the others. So if you wrote a website with JavaScript, it may or may not work on Navigator, and vice versa, which then led to the incredible browser wars that happened in the late 90s. Dawn of the scrolling marquee, for those who remember that. That was all the graphics. That was like I maxed out Google, Google presentation. So yeah, and that went on for a while, and basically, I remember I was designing a lot of websites for the University of Virginia at the time, because my dad worked there and he knew that I was interested in making web pages, and then his colleagues picked up on that and they pulled me in to make websites for their departments, for their labs and departments, and suddenly I was making websites left and right. And I distinctly remember making a site that worked for Internet Explorer and then a site that worked for Navigator. And especially early on, it was even like you go to the home page and it's like, are you using Internet Explorer? Click this link to have the site that's best optimized for your browser. And so glad that's over. All right, so then we move into the ghost of JavaScript present. And by present, I mean really more the last 10 years. When the bell tolls two, the second spirit shows up and says, I am the ghost of JavaScript present. Come in and parse me better, man. Scrooge entered the room and noticed the vast cornucopias of JavaScript libraries. Many libraries now include server calls, explained the spirit. Scrooge soon found himself smiling at this revelation. So in 2005, what is seen in the industry as the JavaScript Renaissance began. This was when Ajax was more or less, I believe Ajax was released prior to this, but specifically with respect to JavaScript, Ajax was put together with JavaScript to now allow JavaScript to call to the server, whereas before JavaScript was purely a client-side initiative. Before I continue, is anyone confused when I say client-side, server-side? Like, what does it mean when a browser? Okay, I will. Okay, so basically a client-side, when you are using a client-side language, it only works within your browser. It doesn't have to go out and try to find a server. It doesn't have to go back to the internet. It just needs to stay in the browser and all the work happens in there, whereas the server side, it has to go ping back the server to pull in information. So things like databases is a great example of something that uses the server-side language. All right. So the first JavaScript libraries were released in 2005. The first one was a tool called MooTools, which is more or less obsolete now, to the point that I don't even remember what it does. But what's significant about 2005 is that the beginnings of jQuery came about, and that, as we will later explore today, I mean, there's a reason why this presentation says an introduction to JavaScript and jQuery. jQuery is still thriving today, and it's basically an easier way of dealing with JavaScript. Later libraries that came out in the later part of the aughts include Node and Meteor. These become more and more server-side languages. We're not going to cover those today. That's more, I would say, advanced JavaScript. And now, which gets us to the present, basically, there's literally a JavaScript library for anything you fancy. Literally anything you fancy. And things come and go as well. In late 2014, when I started working with JavaScript frameworks, Backbone was starting to become like a really big JavaScript library. For those of you who don't know what frameworks are, it's more or less a method of organizing organizing your code in such a way that you can parse it easier. And I won't go any further into that because then it deals into a whole new set of really awesome things I would love to talk about, but not right now. But right now, like Backbone is kind of either established or I've been hearing that it's on its way out. And it blows my mind still because we haven't even started a few days into 2016 and they're already calling for Backbone's end. And so it's, yes, Aaron.
What's replacing?
Marionette. Which I don't know. I mean, I know that was there back in 2014, but apparently it's gotten more robust.
Okay.
You said marionette?
Marionette, like the puppet. But the thing is, there's so many other libraries. There's Knockout. The big three I call are Angular, Ember, and Backbone. Those are the main frameworks that you use in terms of organizing your code. There are plenty of examples for those of you who are interested. Like Hulu, for example, uses Backbone to not only like organize their code into a very simple and minified structure, but also to make quick and simple server calls. So yes, Aaron.
Sorry. What comes with WordPress? I mean, jQuery does, but do the other Backbone and
Backbone now does.
Okay.
From what I remember with the latest release. I know when I first started working with Backbone, with WordPress, which was actually around this time last year, we had to we had to enqueue and register our specific the specific library, which then ended up breaking a whole other set of stuff. But it looks like WordPress adapted to Backbone a lot faster than it did to Angular or Ember. And so that's why it's become the main way, and it's also a very easy framework to pick up. I actually highly recommend Backbone over Angular or Ember, or rather, if you want to learn Angular or Ember, which is kind of more of what enterprise websites use these days, go starting with Backbone and then working outwards is probably the better way of going about things. At least that's from my personal experience. It may be different for others. But let's say you want to visualize a fairly large data set of values. There is a library called D3, as in the letter D and the number 3.js, that does amazing visuals of your data, and it can scale very well to handle very small to tens of millions of data points, all within the confines of JavaScript. Of course, when push comes to shove, sometimes you just have to create a library yourself. And an example I'm going to pull up is work that I've done with jQuery. So obviously I can't show the code because it's protected by our client confidentiality. What is it? The non-disclosure agreement. There we go. But I've built a site. I've worked on a few projects with Coca-Cola, and one of my final projects with them was developing their welcome site for new employees. And basically, what they wanted. I'm going to go ahead and let that load up. There we go. So what they wanted was they wanted to start off with a screen like this, and they wanted animations. Basically, they wanted to use the user to interact with the page to get to the login screen, and also have a Coke bottle that's animated. And they did not want to use Flash because, as we all know, Flash is dead. Long live Flash. And it was an actual formidable task because at the time there weren't as many JavaScript animation libraries. Now there are quite a few. And especially with what they wanted, what Coke wanted was as you'll soon see as I start scrolling down, the colors are going to change, and they wanted the Coke bottle to invert the whatever color is changing. If the background color goes from, let's say, red to white, they want the Coke bottle to go from white to red. And that was something that there was no jQuery for it, no JavaScript libraries in existence. So I actually had to write an animation JavaScript library specifically for Coke. And I'm going to go ahead and scroll down to show how it works. Basically, as I'm scrolling, the text shows up. I think the internet's a bit wonky because usually it doesn't jump that much. But as soon as I hit the Coke bottle, and then also you notice the bubbles that start to show up. Yeah, I think it's the internet that's making this site jumpy. And so basically what's happening is that logo is also, as you're scrolling down, the logo is also spinning around, and it goes from red to white as the color changes. It doesn't show because the leaps are pretty significant. But then it goes all the way to that, and then you type in your login, and this is the onboarding process for new employees for Coke. This is the first site that they go to as soon as they get their paperwork. And for those of you who are interested, I know that we have a few designers in the building, and in fact, actually, before I really got back into programming, one of the things I was doing was graphic designing. And when I got into programming, I had a fear that I was going to lose that creative edge, and programming to me didn't feel creative until I got into animating. In this case, I made a bunch of SVGs. For those of you who don't know, SVGs it's code, but the code, when you display it on a web page, produces an image. And so basically, by animating SVGs to interact the way that it's doing here, let me go ahead and refresh. That allowed me to really work on my creative side. And in fact, it's one of my specialties working with JavaScript is animating SVGs. There are more libraries out there, but I still don't find them as robust as like the library I had to make for this. But that's because I'm biased, because I really like what I did. Yeah. So again, if you have any questions about like work that I've done, please meet me here as soon as the presentation's over, and I will be more than happy to talk to you about that. But yeah, this was all done in JavaScript, and it was actually I think the total file size, including the SVGs, for this animation was probably, I don't think it went over a meg, which when it comes to website development is really, really significant. But when you actually view this site, you feel like, especially with the user interaction, you feel like it's a much weightier a program. So hence, there's the power of JavaScript. An example of that. Okay, let's get back to this. Cool. All right, so jQuery. Okay, so there's also sort of I guess a confusion between JavaScript and jQuery. Some people see them as exactly the same languages. Another example would be going back to job posts, where they're just like all the different programming languages you need to know, JavaScript, jQuery, and they keep them as two separate like entities with two different sets of skills that go alongside them. And there are other people who think they're either completely the same language or completely the opposite language, and in fact they're neither. They're a mix of both. And then for something I said earlier, jQuery is one of the earliest libraries made with JavaScript. So that's that similarity. So yeah, jQuery is the library that allows for already popular JavaScript interactions to now be written with fewer lines of code, and we'll look at an example of those lines of code. And it basically deals mainly with the popular, the ones that the lines of code that are used most often when making dynamic interactions with your web page. So going back to the Coke site that I referenced, one of the reasons why I had to end up writing my own library was because it involved functions that had not been used. It involved interactions that had not been built previously, or if it had not been incorporated into jQuery. And because of that, I had to take a step back and go into JavaScript itself and write a library from scratch. So here's the significant difference between jQuery and JavaScript. jQuery works on all web browsers, no matter what, whereas JavaScript still has some cross-browser compatibility issues. The JavaScript is, I don't know, if there are no glaring compatibility issues that I can bring up right now, but you kind of find them out as you deal with them. It's kind of like especially in the programming world, especially working. I think that's the mantra Micah and I have, especially when dealing with JavaScript, is we code until it breaks, and then we sit around until inspiration strikes us again. It's especially with JavaScript, because there's no really good site out there that lists all the compatibility issues between browsers. I think that's changing. I think I found a site that's good, but I haven't really played around with that. However, jQuery, I can just from my personal experience, it works on all browsers, and that along with writing fewer lines of code to do basically the same set of functions, the same set of interactions, makes jQuery the library to use. The documentation is very robust, and I include the link down there. And I can actually show. I'm going to see if I can pull that over here. Yay. Okay, cool. So this is the jQuery API. And it's one of my favorite APIs out of the many libraries that are out there, just by how it's organized. Basically any questions you have. I mean, yes, obviously when you guys go around playing with JavaScript and jQuery, you're going to go to Google and be like, jQuery, how do I do this? But 9 times out of 10, it'll take you to the API, because the API is that robust. It provides examples. There are even if I'm not mistaken, there are tutorials on here as well, and I would highly recommend, if you're wanting to dabble with jQuery, to start out with the API itself and play around with that.
Tamil,
Yes.
do you recommend learning JavaScript first, or just starting with jQuery?
Yes. I have my personal opinion, then I have my objective opinion.
Well, okay, we're talking in the context of WordPress.
In the context of WordPress, okay. And we'll get to that part at the very end of this presentation, but I will go ahead and say right now that my opinion is that you don't necessarily need, let me put it necessarily, you don't necessarily need to know JavaScript. However, it is good to know, especially when you're dealing with what I showed with the Coke site, when you're dealing with applications, or you're given a project where suddenly you have an obstacle, that there are no JavaScript libraries, or very few and not robust libraries that can work with the situation. Then it's really nice to know JavaScript, because then you can take a step back from jQuery and write those functions out yourself. And that's something you can't necessarily do with jQuery, even though jQuery now is a lot more robust than it was even 5 years ago. And it covers way more functionality, JavaScript functionality, than it did 5 years ago, or even 3 years ago. But that being said, that's where I leave it as. If you're expecting to dabble with there's some who want to, like for example, sir, I think you said you want to improve your blog using JavaScript. Well, if it's going to be like some simple dynamic interactions, or even the more complex ones, jQuery will take care of that. If you want to do something like I showed with the code file, though, there aren't really any libraries for that. So that would be where JavaScript comes in handy, especially with regards to jQuery. Now within WordPress by default, right, you write in pure JavaScript. If you try to write in jQuery, it actually errors out. I will get to that at the very end as to how to prevent that from happening. But yeah, to go back to this, with jQuery, the AJAX, the AJAX is the language, but another way of looking at AJAX is the calls to the server are also included by default. So now in JavaScript, you actually have to write the functions that connect to your server. Here, it is already there. So you can make those selected calls, and that's really, really good. Let's see here. Okay, cool. Here's the example that I have here, and this is these two different sets perform create the exact same outcome for your site. But the first one is JavaScript, the second one is jQuery, and just look how was 1, 2, 3 lines of code for JavaScript ends up becoming 1 line of jQuery. And this is what I meant when I said like it's taking all the popular interactions and simplifying it. So to quickly walk through this, basically what's happening is we want to change the background color, and we want to create a function that changes this background color, and in this case we want to change it to red. So in JavaScript, what we would have to do is write out the function called change background, and then we would have to specify the document object model, the hierarchy behind it. So that we're taking the document, we're modifying the body, and we're modifying the style, which is the CSS of that body, and the background in particular, and that's equal to color, which is the variable that we're going to put in, and then on load we say that variable is red. So it plugs that in. When the DOM is loaded, it overrides the CSS file. So whatever that CSS file says, let's say this is the background color needs to be black. If the JavaScript says change background red, it will override that CSS and put in red as your background. So when the DOM is loaded and the site shows, then you see a red background. All that is compiled into jQuery by that line. That $sign means jQuery, and we'll look at that when we explore jQuery and WordPress. And then .css is the method that's being used. It's saying we are modifying the CSS, the style of this page, and then changing the background in red. So you can, this is a simple example to see the change, but it's enough to show just how much jQuery has simplified the use of dynamic interactions, creating dynamic interactions on your site. Okay, that's the next one. Yes. Okay. So yeah, I had a small like jQuery thing that we could work with, and then my Mac kind of sputtered when it tried to upgrade to El Capitan. So I didn't push the repo, so shame on me. So I don't have those examples, but we can more definitely talk about them, especially when we get to jQuery and WordPress. So returning to the story that goes through JavaScript future. And so the bell tolls 3, and the third apparition appears, and Scrooge says, "I am in the presence of the ghost of JavaScript yet to come," said Scrooge. The spirit answered not, but pointed onward with his hand. Scrooge peered down at his smartwatch. "Do you mean to tell me, spirit, that JavaScript will soon scale all the way down to this?" The spirit said not a word and continued to point. And my response to that is the future is already here. And that is because I'm wearing a smartwatch right now. It's the Pebble smartwatch. But what's so cool about it is that you program this smartwatch in JavaScript. It is a very simple smartwatch, which is why JavaScript is all you need to use. But if you have an Android Wear device, I have no idea about the Apple Watch. I'm going to assume not. But at least with the Android Wear, I know it gives the JavaScript option. And for those of you who have a Pebble smartwatch or who would like to get one in the near future, there is an app for the smartwatch called simply.js. And it's a really quick app you can put on there. And all you have to do is you write really simple JavaScript code and you just push to the app. And it is as simple as that. And there's no wires. You just write it in your IDE or whatever text editor that you use, save it to the file that that app refers to, and it will update on your phone. Sorry, on your smartwatch. And it's really cool to play around with what the capabilities of JavaScript are. For those of you who are designers, this is also a great place to play around with watch faces. For those of you who have heard about the function, the vast array of watch faces that you can make, or even those that already exist within the Pebble library, all of those are created using JavaScript. So to make a watch face is actually just a few lines of code in JavaScript. So definitely look into that. I would highly recommend the Pebble API, and you can look into that. And if you have any more questions on that, I've been playing around with my Pebble smartwatch for quite some time, so I'm more than willing to answer questions on that. Mobile apps and websites now more and more are having JavaScript, not just on the front end, but also the back end, which is why I immediately follow it with Calypso, which I think was announced a month ago. Something I know Diana and I talked about a month or two ago. First of December, yes.
US,
Yes. And it had already existed for those of you who have a WordPress.com site, which is where the dashboard is located on the browser. It's not you don't have to make a local dev server. It's all done by the browser. That was had already been using Calypso, already been using the JavaScript backend. Kathy, I want to say it was already in Calypso at the last WordCamp. Do you remember that? When that first day?
US WordCamp?
Yeah.
Never called it Calypso. Yeah.
Okay. I don't think it was called. Was it being called Calypso then?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I guess I wasn't here. I wasn't paying attention. But okay, cool.
Basically, they took what was in .com and announced that it was rolled out and available.
Okay.
for download.
Okay, yes. And that right there is the developer.wordpress.com/Calypso. That's the link you can use to download your copy of that. Is it in beta or is it now official with the latest release?
I think it's official, and they announced the Mac version first, and now the Windows version is out as well.
Okay, so that's
Yeah, I was
I don't think it's
hesitating when you
beta.
said the newest version was.
the latest release
Yeah, but
of
I
WordPress.
don't know if it was it pulled out Diana before 4.4?
I'm sorry?
Yeah, it was out because 4.4 didn't come out till Tuesday after.
After
right.
State of the Word, yeah.
Okay. So there have been some developments in that. That's cool. When I was playing around with it about a month ago, it was in a GitHub repo that it was like, download and play around with it as much as you like, but it was not with the update the latest release. So that's awesome that they're pushing this incredibly fast. But it also, that's the thing about JavaScript, you can make very robust backends without personally the convolutedness of PHP. I've been working with WordPress I've developed with WordPress sites since late 2014, since I joined, started working with Mike and Micah, and it hasn't been impossible, but it has been an interesting experience because PHP is not unlike any other language I've experienced. So the fact that JavaScript has now become a major source to the back end of WordPress is pretty significant. Because it will make things a lot easier. JavaScript, WordPress now will run a lot faster, is one of the main pros behind this, especially when you're dealing with the dashboard. Because with old WordPress, it would make calls to the server all the time, right? Yes, it would make calls to the server all the time. Now, it makes selected calls using Ajax. And so now basically the bandwidth needed to interact with the server has been cut down significantly to where it's needed most. And so yeah, for those that, I guess if it's out with the latest release of WordPress, then for those of you who are tinkering with WordPress, just download the release and play around with it. I need to do that, I guess, once this presentation is over and I'm back home. So, okay, and then another thing about the future of JavaScript is the fact that they're trying to standardize it. So we went through the history, talked about in the beginning of the browser wars, and the browser wars more or less have been continuing even to this day. But all that has changed last year with the ECMA, which I don't remember what the acronym stands for, but it is basically the governing body that officiates what goes through, like what is JavaScript, and defines those languages as as an example, are now standardizing and improving JavaScript as a whole. And starting with ES6, which is also known as Harmony, they have a very ambitious plan of every year refining JavaScript, standardizing it, making it easier, getting rid of a lot of the convolutedness and sort of almost like the contradictions that JavaScript has inherently. Surprisingly, they're still keeping the scrolling marquee, as I found out. But it's really cool. I just started looking into it, and they have this new variable. Like when you call variables in JavaScript, if you use var, and you also use var when you use jQuery, for those of you who have used either or both. With starting with ES6, you use a variable called let. You stop using var, but you use let. And what it does is that let now takes into consideration calls to the server. So instead of having to specify what those variables are, for example, let now sort of encapsulates all of them. And it takes care of any error messages as well. So if you made, for those of you who know, like try catches, being able to catch mistakes before they get released. If you were writing pure JavaScript, you have to make sure to write those loops to just in case those things show up. And even in WordPress, there's something called no conflict, where you would have to create that to make sure, well, in the example of jQuery, if the $sign used in jQuery, if you are using another JavaScript-based library in the same WordPress project that also uses the $sign, whether or not it's used in the same way, it'll break jQuery. Even if it's the native jQuery to WordPress, it'll still break it. And it's unless of course you use no conflict. And I know I introduced it. I'm sure some of you are intrigued about it, but that's something I can talk about afterwards. But it's a really cool catch method. But with ES6, it's actually something that is already built in with the let variable. And for those who are interested in learning more about that, the documentation that ECMA has on it is really, really good. For those who have already been working with Meteor and React, it has already begun using ES6. In particular, React already, it's very much native. The way that you write React apps already takes into account ES6. So if you are starting off your JavaScript learning with React, which is very ambitious, but still definitely worth it. For those of you who don't know what React is, best example to say is the Facebook newsfeed is written in React. Actually, Facebook is the one that created React. It's just it's an in situ update methodology that's applied to web pages. Okay, I think that is it for that. Okay, cool. So now we get to using jQuery in WordPress. And the reason I included this, well, first of all, this is a WordPress meetup. But at the same time, one thing that I know, one of the biggest mistakes I know about JavaScript in WordPress, and jQuery works for WordPress specifically, and I know this because I made that mistake so many times when I started out with WordPress development, is to go ahead and in your JavaScript, in your HTML page, or index.php page, include a script tag that calls to your JavaScript page, which then, of course, you get the error message that pops up at the very top of your web page when you go to it, or even worse, you get the white screen of death. And when I learned what the white screen of death was, yeah, I was freaking out. I thought I was going to get fired. It was interesting. But it was, the only reason is because WordPress has a lot of security measures in place. And because of that, they don't allow you to just quickly connect to other files as is. You have to go through a process. And specifically, you don't need to pull in jQuery for your WordPress site. I know that there are people out there who want to use the latest jQuery that with their WordPress site, and this is another thing as well. The release that you're using of WordPress may or may not include the latest release of jQuery. In most cases, it doesn't. It uses an older jQuery. However, I highly recommend to not deregister and then re-register your own jQuery or the latest jQuery. Because yes, it may be the latest and you want to play around with it. However, that version of WordPress is optimized with that version of jQuery. Or actually, it's the other way around. That version of jQuery used by WordPress is optimized for that version of WordPress. If you were to deregister that jQuery library and put in your own, whether it's the latest one or an earlier one, more than likely you will break things. Whether within your WordPress dev environment or with any plugins or themes that you make, because all of those are optimized. Or more importantly, the plugins and themes that you use that you pull in from outside, because they are more than likely using either the native jQuery within that WordPress. I do know of a few plugins, and it's also why I take the micro approach of, if there's a plugin I need, I'd rather build it, unless it's something very, very complex and robust, like WooCommerce or something. Basically, it boils down to the fact that a lot of plugin developers and a lot of theme developers do make this mistake still of pulling in the latest jQuery and deregistering the jQuery that goes with the version of WordPress that they have. And sure, it works fine for them. They know they're experienced developers in some cases to where they can fix those errors on their version, but when that plugin gets pushed to other versions and that it's meant to be compatible with, it breaks. And it hurts them, especially if their business is making plugins and or themes, it hurts them in the long run. So I'm going to go ahead and show this. Okay, so when you use jQuery in WordPress, the first thing you need to do is go to your functions.php file. In there, you write, and I totally forgot to put this on the slide, so I'm just going to say it out loud, and there is no marker board around, so I might actually write it in Notepad. Haha! I do end up getting to pull out Notepad today. Okay, okay, I'm going to pull this back here real quick and increase the size of the font. Basically, in functions.php, you are going to write, there we go. So, functions.php. You are going to write WP underscore NQ. Oh gosh, am I spelling that right? WordPress table NQ.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because it looks wrong, yeah, I think it's right.
Okay, that's
But I can
usually,
never spell it.
yeah. NQ script parentheses. Whoops, now I spelled that wrong, that's for sure. And that's what you would need to write. And I believe you don't need to do this anymore, but I could be wrong. But after you NQ, you also register your script.
No, you no longer need to register.
You don't want,
Just
okay.
have to queue it.
Okay, cool, awesome.
It's already registered.
What version did that change? Is that in 4.4?
I think it was 4.3, actually.
Really?
I think so.
Okay,
I do.
cool. So that's all you need to. That's all you need. So what it does when you NQ that script, it NQs and registers the jQuery library that is already within your WordPress development environment.
And it's semicolon. Semicolon.
Oh, yes, that's
Just
that saves me hours of debugging actually. And then from there, that's where it gets fun, because even though you wrote that in and now the JavaScript library is activated, you still cannot. The code that I showed you before, this.body.css ... If you were to write that in your JavaScript file, that still doesn't work. And that's because WordPress, even though we included the jQuery library, still does not recognize the $sign. I thought it was because there's just something else in WordPress that utilizes that $sign, and I found out no, it's just actually it's one of those very weird things that WordPress has, where you can include the jQuery library, which is meant to recognize the $sign, but WordPress will not, and therefore you'll break your site if you were to use the $sign. However, there are ways to go around it, and these are the ways. Let me go ahead and have, whoops, let me click here. There we go. So these are the three different methods. The top left method, all three of these do exactly the same thing. What I'm doing is I'm creating an alias that will basically allow me to use the $sign. Because if you don't use the $sign, pointer, what you would have to do with every jQuery command, you would have to write out jQuery. And you would have to write it out in this format too, lowercase j, uppercase q, which it does add time in the long run. So a lot of people, what they do is they create that alias so that way when they write their code, they can then use the $sign. And for most people, myself included, it's so that I'm not breaking away from my knowledge of jQuery just for WordPress. I'd rather make a little exception that will now create that alias instead of adapting to this, and then let's say I go back to making it just a bootstrap site without WordPress, and then writing my jQuery, my JavaScript pages in the WordPress format of jQuery. It's best to keep it in the format of sort of the jQuery API, which is the $sign. Now, this particular method is useful for JavaScript functions that you want to execute after the DOM has been loaded. So in other words, after the site has been loaded, all the JavaScript that happens after that, this is the preferred method of writing it. However, if you have JavaScript that is executing prior to the DOM loading up, you would want to use this. And it is fewer lines of code, and to be honest, this is the version I use, because this also includes this. Like this is not a before DOM and this is an after DOM. This is before and after, whereas this is only after. And for most people, their usage of jQuery within their WordPress sites, a lot of that stuff gets executed after the DOM is loaded. So this is why most tutorial sites that you go to, or at least from the ones that I've found of the popular jQuery tutorial sites, this is the one they teach. However, this is the one I learned from trial and error to use. And I highly recommend this because it incorporates everything pre-DOM, but it also incorporates everything post-DOM. And where I have the comment here that says use $, that's where I write all my jQuery code. And writing here function, for those of you who know basic jQuery, the document.ready, executes all the code, all the JavaScript after the DOM is loaded. Document.ready means when my HTML, CSS, JavaScript, when all my pages are loaded and my DOM has been established, then run all this code. And all this right here, this document.ready is already encapsulated within this function $, which is really awesome.
So it's okay to use that in the header?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And I will say once again that I recommend this. Besides the fact that it's fewer words to write, but just because you never know when you're going to need something to run JavaScript-wise that's going to happen before your page loads. So it's better to just have that instead of writing that and then spending hours or days trying to figure out what exactly went wrong. Yes.
Okay, so the issue is that you put JavaScript in the header, then it all has to be parsed before the site begins to load. How does that function know what it needs before the DOM and after? Or does it, I mean, if it parses it all, then you're shooting yourself in the foot, right?
Right. Well, it specifically looks for these functions, and that's something that is based within the jQuery library within WordPress.
Okay.
So functions.php loads up, obviously, all of that prior to onload, prior to the DOM being established. So it already will already be parsing through your code, looking for jQuery, looking for the word jQuery, and then what do you do with jQuery? So in this case, I'm saying jQuery and then attaching document.ready, creating that function of the $. This right here is a line of jQuery. This is the line of jQuery that is native to WordPress, and this function right here is the function that's saying that $, is now masking jQuery.
Right.
Whereas here,
Okay, got it.
here that's already included.
Got it.
And that's I think to answer your question, it's because that is within the jQuery library for WordPress. This third method is my shotgun method. It's the method that I use if I'm trying to quickly make something, or I'm quickly trying to test something, and this is something I can directly write into my JavaScript files or my JavaScript files in WordPress, and that is assigning a variable to jQuery and then using that variable from there on out. Now you cannot use just $, in WordPress. You have to put something else after that. So the popular thing to use is just a lowercase j. So I've done this a few times when I'm trying to test out a library in WordPress, or I have a new build and I don't want, before moving files over to this new build, I want to make sure this new thing that I'm trying out is working properly. I would write it in this method, and then I would write out my jQuery as I would any other way. Except now I have to keep in mind of that lowercase j. That's the only downside to this, which is why I only recommend it if you are trying to quickly test something. But for your official build, definitely use one of these two, or in this case, I prefer this one right here. I think that is it. Yes, perfect. That is it. That is all I have. So yeah, opening up for questions.
Newbie curiosity question. So if you didn't assign the $, variable in WordPress, what would WordPress like you to use to signify jQuery?
Okay. Yes, going back to that. I wish I had a pointer. Can you guys see my mouse? Okay. So this right here, writing the word jQuery, in particular in this format with the lowercase j and the uppercase q, that is what tells WordPress that I'm using jQuery.
Okay.
Yeah. Just writing document.ready or just writing in $document.ready, that would do nothing. That would break the site. WordPress would recognize it. So it is jQuery, and all three of these are three different ways of masking that jQuery or rewriting it in terms of a variable that we would prefer to use. In both of these are masking jQuery with just the $. This down here is just a $, something. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Well, I already said that. Okay, cool. So, yeah, that's basically it. I have contact cards up here, business cards for anyone who wants to contact me about any question regarding JavaScript or jQuery.